thank you all for coming today. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. I've also had the pleasure of spending the weekend with them at the Freedom Forum, so I'm really excited to reflect a little bit more on everything we spoke about for the last 3 days. As you know, we have with us Maurice Middleberg, who runs Free the Slaves, and he has been working on these issues for many, many years. He oversees the organization's wide range of innovative anti-trafficking initiatives around the world. And this happens both at a local sort of policy advocacy level and abroad. And he brings diverse experience in about 50 countries, I think it is. And he's worked with the likes of CARE and USAID and the Futures Group, so we're really excited to hear from him. And our very own Katherine Jolluck, who is a senior lecturer and coordinator of the Public History Public Service track in the Department of History here. I'm also very pleased to announce that she's recently become a senior fellow at our center, the WSC Honda Center for Human Rights and International Justice. She has expertise on 20th century Eastern Europe and Russia, where she focuses on the topics of women in war, women in communist societies, nationalism, and then more recently she's been involved in human trafficking work. And she's very active in several Bay Area anti-trafficking initiatives here. So very pleased to have them. I want to give a shout out to the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, who's co-sponsored this event. So with that, we'll get started. Maurice is going to open it up with sort of the broad international overview. He'll speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have Professor Jolluck sort of zoom in locally, speak for the same, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And I should just let you know we are video recording, so if you have any issues with that, you can let me know at the end and we'll work it out. So, thank you very much.
Okay, Jesse, thank you so very much. It's been a real pleasure being here over the last, actually, 5 days, and as part of the Freedom and Slavery Forum, and to be back on the Stanford campus, which is such a beautiful place, and we've been so warmly received, and thank you all for coming. I want to do 3 things this morning in the time that's allotted. I want to introduce you to Free the Slaves as an organization, so you have a little bit of a sense of where we're coming from. Then talk a little bit about some facts and figures, since I don't know how familiar everybody is with sort of the global portrait. And then talk more specifically about what came out of the event that we just held over the course of the last few days. So on the card that you have in front of you is some basic information about Free the Slaves. We were founded in 2000. The mission of the organization is to liberate those who are in slavery, and more importantly, to change the conditions that allow slavery to be perpetuated. We work currently in 6 countries. We work in Brazil, Haiti, Ghana, DR Congo, India, and Nepal. And our basic take on the slavery issue is that slavery is the result of vulnerability, and more specifically, it's disproportionately among the impoverished rural villages in South Asia and West and Central Africa. Those are the regions of the world in which slavery is most prevalent. And to really working always with and through local NGO partners, to work with those partners to build community resistance to human trafficking and slavery. And there are 3 core pillars to our work. The first of which is around community education and mobilization. What we have found is that people in those communities often don't know what their rights are. So, for example, a very common form of slavery is debt bondage, where a family will experience a financial crisis, they borrow money, and then the money is really coming from a loan shark, and they end up enslaved in perpetuity trying to pay off this loan. Part of the tragedy here is that they don't know that's a crime. They borrow the money and say, well, I have to pay that person back until they tell me it's paid off, and of course that never happens. What they should be doing is going to the police. So there's an education component about how to migrate safely, which we see a lot in our Nepal program. We're not telling people you can't migrate, but how do you migrate safely? So there's a rights and risks education component combined with the mobilization of anti-slavery committees at the village level. So there's an organized, trained group that is working inside the community that helps protect the community from predators. So there's this education and mobilization pillar of our work, which helps attack that part of the vulnerability. There's a second pillar which addresses another vulnerability, which is access to legal protections. Often, it is sometimes the case that the laws in the countries in which we operate are quite weak. Until recently in Haiti, for example, there were no criminal penalties for holding a child in domestic servitude. And one of my Haitian colleagues once said to me, if you stole a car to steal a child, you could go to prison for stealing the car, but not for stealing the child. So we work with an advocacy coalition. There's a new law in Haiti which does impose criminal penalties. But more often the problem is not so much the law on the books, but the failure of enforcement of the laws that are on the books. So again, that has to do with doing advocacy work to get governments to actually implement the laws that are on the books. Sometimes, though, it's more a question of capacity. So we do training of government authorities and police so that they know what their laws say and how to go about implementing them. So there's a bundle around enhanced legal protections. And the third bundle is access to basic social services. And this includes particularly schooling, health, and credit. Children who are out of school are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. Families who don't have access to basic affordable health care will be driven into a financial crisis. That drives them to the loan shark. Why do they go to the loan shark? They go to the loan shark because there isn't a legitimate source of credit. So this bundle of access to basic social services. Now, allied to that is where we actually are able to rescue people out of slavery, that provide social services to those who are rescued. Because what you can't do is sort of take people out of a carpet factory or a brick kiln or a stone quarry or a brothel, put them back on the street and say, good luck. You really have to have a comprehensive set of social services that support the transition back into a life of freedom and dignity. And so, for example, we support an ashram in northern India where girls and young women who have been victimized by sex trafficking can spend anywhere from 6 months to 2 years at that ashram until they're able to reclaim their lives. So those are the three basic pillars of our work that we think address the underlying vulnerabilities that we believe are endemic to slavery on a global basis. We show you some of the facts from our work here in terms of the impact that it has had on the cards you have in front of you. And we're now able to document the rescue of about 11,000 people out of slavery. Just some facts and figures that you'll find on the front side of this card. Again, just I don't know how familiar everybody is with the magnitude of the problem. How big the slavery problem is actually a big question, and there's a lot of debate over this. The International Labor Organization says it's 21 million people in slavery. There are estimates as high as 36 million people. There is some degree to which my own view of this is it doesn't matter. You know, we're having this big debate in the field. Is it 21 million? Is it 27 million? Is it 30 million? Is it 36 million? What's pretty clear from every estimate that's out there is there's tens of millions of people who are afflicted with this heinous crime. And as one of my colleagues, Tim McCarthy, who's a history professor at Harvard, said when Harriet Tubman was bringing people out of slavery, what she didn't do was say, I wonder if there's 1 million or 1.5 million people in slavery. She just acted to get people out of slavery. But we know there's a lot out there. In the United States, many people have the idea that when they hear about human trafficking, the first thing that pops to mind is sex trafficking. And while it is certainly a very important and terrible problem, globally, it's actually just about a fifth of all human slavery. About 80% is actually labor trafficking. People are put in conditions of forced labor. So most of this is actually happening in the private sector, in industries where manual labor is the primary means of production. So it's construction, it's agriculture, it's restaurants, it's stone quarries, it's brick kilns, it's fishing. Wherever you see a sector, an economic sector, where most of the production is being done by hand, that's where you're likely to find slavery. And so that's really where we want to focus. The majority are women and girls, about 55%, according to the ILO data, are women and girls, about a quarter are children. As I said, the real epicenters of the problem are in South Asia, that is India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Southeast Asia to some degree, and then West and Central Africa. So that's a little bit just sort of what we see are sort of the key underlying dynamics of slavery, why we think it happens, and the order of magnitude and just some key data around it. So what I want to share with you now then is we then ask the question, well, we start to think about not only the work of our individual organization, but more broadly, what is the state of the anti-slavery movement? We at Free the Slaves are in the process of developing a 10-year vision for the organization, and so we worked with Jolluck to develop a landscape analysis to really look at what is the state of the anti-slavery movement, and along with that, with a group of other organizations helped organize it, particularly with our good friends and colleagues at Stanford, organized the Freedom from Slavery Forum, which brought together 41 organizations who work in this field to really talk about what's the state of the movement and what can we do about it. And that's what I want to share with you now. So as I said, this was a joint effort of Free the Slaves and Jolluck Consulting. The purpose was to draw a portrait of it, and the method we used, which has its limitations admittedly, was to do interviews of people who are leading figures in the field, about 30-odd people are leading figures in the field, heads of organizations, government officials, scholars, as well as the whole series of focus groups, and really probe them around what they thought was the state of the anti-slavery movement, as well as secondary research and a lot of lit review to get a handle on what the state of the movement is. Now, the good news is that since our organization was founded, it's important to acknowledge there actually has been a lot of progress. Compared to where we were 15 years ago, there's much greater public awareness. If you had said, it's still true to some degree, but much less so, if you had said to somebody, well, there's slavery still exists, people would have reacted with just complete disbelief and shock. But we got rid of that in 1865, that's over. It doesn't exist anymore. And people now recognize that it's not completely true, but much more so than it was 15 years ago. There's a widespread perception that there is, in fact, a human trafficking problem. And that's really important and great progress. We have, in fact, a much better policy environment than was the case. Since 2000, the United States, for example, adopted the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It's been reauthorized in 2013. It was reauthorized with some expansion of the language and the provisions, some refinements that we think were really healthy. The Palermo Protocol was adopted by the UN. Most countries have now adopted some legal framework that really tries to work against human trafficking. So it's a much better policy, but at least there are laws on the books. And it has to be said that 15 or 20 years ago, that was not the case. So that's really been significant progress. Again, there are some additional resources that have come into the field. I will talk a little bit about the severe limitations of those, but certainly it's better than it was 15 years ago. And there are a lot of players in this field now. We've learned a great deal of practical way about what works and doesn't work. And there is some research, though there are continuing to be really significant gaps in the body of knowledge that need to be addressed. And what's evolved out of all of that, at least in our perception, are three basic schools of thought and action around how to attack the human trafficking or the modern-day slavery problem. There's the community empowerment model, and that's really what I talked about, sort of free the slaves approach. And what that says is, look, you have to take a community as a whole. In a highly vulnerable community, slavery will manifest in many different forms, and what you want to do is address the underlying vulnerabilities that then lead people to different forms of slavery, whether it's sex slavery or labor trafficking or migration or what have you. There's a different take on this, which is more a supply chain take, where there are organizations that tend to focus more on a specific economic sector. So what they'll say is, look, we know that there is a high degree of slavery in palm oil, or fishing, or cocoa, or coffee, or electronics. And what we're going to do is work with the industry and work through the industry to get down to the lowest levels of the supply chain where slavery happens, and basically try to eliminate the demand for the products that are produced by slave labor. And that's really the method that we're going to use to attack slavery. And there's a third school, which is more of what I would call the rule of law or criminal justice approach, which says, look, fundamentally this is a crime, right? This is being undertaken sometimes by organized crime, but this is something where people need to be put in jail for committing a crime. And so the emphasis is more on finding perpetrators, prosecuting them, and giving them severe sentences as a way of dissuading this kind of behavior. Now, it should be said that these are not mutually exclusive, that you will find that actual organizations, there's blurring of lines between these different schools. So when we do community empowerment, as we rescue people, part of what we do is then work with prosecutors to put people in jail. So these are not mutually exclusive. You'll find there's, as I say, blurring of lines between these different schools of thought or schools of action. But I have found a helpful way to think about the different approaches of organizations where they give their emphasis in terms of attacking the slavery issue. And what's emerged out of all of this is an ecosystem of actors who play different roles, both in terms of the approach that they take, but also different roles. So there are people who are focused more on policy advocacy, for example. So you have organizations that's really what they're focusing on, is trying to change the policy environment. There are ones that are more focused on service delivery, and even within service delivery, prevention as opposed to survivor services. So you have this whole array now of actors, and there's a lot of players in the field now. The Global Slavery Directory now lists globally 1,300 organizations that in one way or another claim to be involved in doing anti-trafficking work. So, and certainly you wouldn't have said that again 15 or 20 years ago, that there's so many different players who are in the field. Now, that said, there are some very real and serious challenges to the movement that are present. One of them is the evidence gap, and this manifests in two ways. One is, to which I alluded earlier, are the gaps in our understanding of the magnitude and dynamics of the problem. So frankly, as I said, I'm not that interested in what's the global number, but what we're really missing are local prevalence studies that allow us in northern India or eastern Congo or western Ghana to say, look, we've done the survey work or the qualitative, more anthropological work, getting into communities and really understanding how bad is the problem in a way that's really measurable at that level, and what are the context-specific dynamics. So we have a rich body of data around how big is the problem and why does it manifest, what are the dynamics behind the way it manifests in different contexts. Tied to that is rigorous evaluation of anti-slavery programs. Doing real programmatic evaluation is, for those who've ever done it, is very expensive, very time-consuming, really hard, right? And that there's very little of that has actually been done. So while there are these schools of thought, if you said, well, is there really a body of evaluation research that has tested the relative efficacy of these different approaches? We're not there. We do not have that level of evidence. Now, I will say that one of the things that we are trying to do with Freedom of Slaves is to validate our approach. So the model that I described to you very briefly, the model that I described to you very briefly, we actually have now articulated into a full causal model. We then attach indicators to every variable in the model. We develop data collection instruments around every variable in the model. And we are, over this 2014 to 2016 period, really trying to assess the impact of our work. So I need to move faster. Resource limitations. Sorry. Okay, resource limitations. As you see on this card, there's $150 billion a year in profits that go to traffickers. That's the profits of traffickers. The total U.S. appropriation in FY15 to fight human trafficking is $112 million. And the U.S. is far and away the big player in trying to fight trafficking. So we're trying to fight an elephant with a pop gun. The resources are frankly pathetic relative to the magnitude of the problem. Notwithstanding the progress in the policy environment, we continue to have lots of issues around actually the implementation of the policies that are on the books. So this is a major problem in the field. And what we don't have, because this is still a relatively young field, is an architecture for collaboration around all the actors in the movement. And so that is the fundamental reason that we actually organized this forum, is to begin to bring players together so we can identify the ways that we can work together more effectively. So, and here's the areas where we think we need action. One is to just have a mechanism, have a structure, have an architecture that allows us to work together where that makes sense. Doesn't mean we should do everything together, but where it makes sense for us to collaborate, to be able to mobilize resources, and to have a policy agenda around which we rally so that there's one unified voice in terms of getting policy change. And here are some of the main things that came out of this year's forum. There was a working group that worked for most of a year on evidence and measurement. They did a survey of the monitoring and evaluation practices of the participating organizations, so we now have a much better handle on, well, what are organizations actually doing to try to assess their work and what's beginning to come out of that. There was a group that reviewed 165 evaluations. There's a lot of questions around it, so God bless them for taking that. But there's a lot of range in terms of the quality of those as really evaluations. But that said, it was really effort. And what was really nice about that is they began to extract some promising practices about what seems to work and what doesn't seem to work. There was a group that worked on standards and norms for survivor services. One of the issues is what's the minimum package for survivors of human trafficking. There are a lot of organizations doing really good work. There are some organizations that aren't doing it well because they don't know. And there's some evil organizations that are pretending to offer survivor services, a way of luring people back into trafficking. Believe me, in this business, the ability of some people to act in a depraved way is not being shocked because it's quite stunning. So what they did is basically survey, they picked up 50 different standards that people are using, and we were trying to create a synthesis of those different standards. And then this is, I think, very exciting, is we've coalesced around an advocacy agenda for the presidency. So basically going to the candidates and saying, this is what the anti-slavery community wants in the out of the next presidency to move forward. And there was another group that very recently, actually just a week ago, the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are some SDGs that are specifically around the eradication of slavery and what can we do to be supportive of the implementation of that SDG. So that's my presentation. Thank you all for being patient and listening. I know I went over time, but thank you, Jesse. Thanks very much.
Well, in part, he made my job easier because we were at the same school, and he talked about there's definitely overlap in our two presentations. But I wanted to just say a little bit specifically about the domestic U.S. situation and even more specifically the Bay Area, which I'm most familiar with now. And I also want to echo what Maurice said, that despite the fact that there's multiple reasons to be abhorred and depressed, there has been really a sea change in the U.S. and in the Bay Area in the past 15 years. Starting again with the year 2000 and the U.S. Legislation, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which became federal law first in 2000 and then was most recently reauthorized in 2013. But besides that, the individual states in the country have adopted anti-trafficking laws and penalties. Counties, now sort of just thinking of California, counties and cities have been developing task forces on human trafficking and trying to put together coalitions to work on the problem in their specific area. At the sort of top level again, we've got the national hotline that you're all aware of from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. And the purpose of this hotline, first and foremost, is to link survivors with the services that they need in their own local area. So someone can call and the national hotline and they can be connected with the proper services where they live. But also, and this is increasingly important, it collects data for the United States. And I just wanted to give you just a tiny sense of what this call center is getting. And I should point out that it's not just phone calls, there's also a text messaging capability. They can also get emails. And a lot of what this national hotline gets are tips. They're not necessarily all calls or text messages from people in a situation of trafficking. They're not all survivors, but they can be tips that lead to uncovering a situation of human trafficking. And so now I think the average is about 200 calls or texts per day come to the center. Again, many of these are tips, and they can also be about the same survivors. So it doesn't mean they're necessarily discrete cases. In the year 2014, they received a little over 24,000 contacts. I think they refer to them as signals, so that can either be phone, text messages, emails, that led to the identification of a little over 5,000 separate cases of human trafficking. In these statistics, 71% were cases of sex trafficking, labor trafficking was 16%, and then both labor and trafficking in the same case was about 4%. And here too, whether you're looking globally, domestically, or even locally, you'll find that the statistics look like sex trafficking is the biggest issue, and it's pretty much understood that it's a bias in reporting and awareness, because that's what people think of, now that we even think of trafficking, which is already progress, and to think that these are situations of human trafficking and slavery, still most people think of sex trafficking, and that's what gets noticed, that's what gets reported. So that's part of the slant in the statistics. Also, it's harder in the US to find, in the Bay Area as well, to find people who are in situations of labor trafficking. They're more hidden, people aren't aware of them. They tend to be more often foreign-born, and so they don't know of their rights, they don't have connections, they don't often have the language, they're afraid of being deported. So you can't take the statistics of the calls and the identified cases to mean that that's an accurate portrayal of the balance between sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Also, as far as the U.S. situation goes, there's definitely been changes in policing. It's not uniform by any means, but certainly in places like San Francisco, San Jose, there is an increasing effort to look for labor trafficking. I think that's where the lag is still the greatest. But there's a tremendous change in terms of looking at and finding and understanding cases of sex trafficking. So now you have many police departments changing their vice squads, which would go after prostitutes for the purpose of arresting them and throwing them in jail, to approach situations of prostitution as potential human trafficking situations, and therefore they call them increasingly special victims units. And they look to see, is this a situation where the victim, rather than being a criminal, was coerced, needs services, needs some protection, and therefore trying to go after the trafficker instead. And again, it's not uniform by any means, but there are some real bright spots, and I've met some police officers in the Bay Area who are, and not just the Bay Area, I don't want to say we have a monopoly on this, but really incredible changes, and their thinking is just worlds apart from what it was 20 years ago. I also wanted to say something about the dismal level of funding in the U.S. and point out the same statistics that the U.S. government spends about $120 million a year for all of its anti-trafficking efforts, and that's both abroad and internationally combined. And then as comparison, so again, big $120 million a year. For HIV/AIDS, $7.5 billion a year. For cancer research and prevention campaigns, $5.4 billion per year. And then the war on drugs, $22.5 billion per year. So it's clear that we're getting nothing, and it has to be ramped up to make a difference. So just a little bit about California, and then I'll say something about the Bay Area. statistics, whatever statistics you get with just a slice of what that particular body or agency has come in contact with, unless of course they're the projections, which are the high-level projections. But if you just look at what this national hotline collects from California, and again, that's only the cases that have been reported to the hotline. So that doesn't cover anything that was uncovered by, on the ground by local police officers, because they're not going to call the hotline to report this. So just from the national hotline in the year 2014, from the state of California, there were 912 potential cases of human trafficking reported. And they came up with a figure of 815 actual victims of human trafficking in the state of California in 2014. Again, you'll still see that same bias in the breakdown. 75% of these cases and victims were involved in sex trafficking, 16% in labor trafficking, and 4% both were involved in both. If you look at Santa Clara, I can give you some local data, but again, here you could say, well, it's not just Santa Clara, it's sort of the Bay Area. Why? Because Santa Clara isn't, a fenced-in space, and so, first of all, people who are trafficked are often moved repeatedly, and they might move from Las Vegas to Oakland to San Jose to San Francisco. So the figures that I can give you from Santa Clara represent what the different agencies, the people they come in contact with, the survivors they come in contact with and give services to. There are people left out. People from the Bay Area might receive services in Wisconsin or Texas, because that's where they're brought. Also, the different organizations in the Bay Area might see the same person, depending on what services. So none of these statistics can be considered conclusive, but just to have a sense, because I know many people that I talk to are still shocked that, well, what do you mean if there's slavery in the Bay Area? Yeah, there is, and people are becoming aware of that more and more. But so one organization, the South Bay Coalition to End Human Trafficking, in the past year dealt with 99 survivors of sex trafficking, 64 of labor trafficking, and then 22 who were involved in both. Another figure from Bay Area Legal Aid, 14 in sex trafficking, 22 in labor trafficking, and 1 person in both. So again, this is just to show you that there are cases here. It's just the tip of an iceberg, and we don't know how big that iceberg is. I will say that from the local data, particularly from law enforcement, again, sex trafficking cases are identified much more frequently than labor trafficking. And again, of the people who are identified in the Bay Area, most of them are women, and most of them are U.S. citizens. And that's, again, because what seems to be the case is that most of the women and children, women and girls involved in sex trafficking tend to be American-born, whereas the labor trafficking situations involve more foreign-born, which is why it looks like most of the human trafficking survivors in the Bay Area are U.S. citizens. Again, it's pretty much believed that in labor trafficking in the Bay Area, most of the people are foreign-born. And I want to just give you, I can actually circulate, I just unfortunately have one copy, but I have put together little tiny snippets of actual cases that have been dealt with in the Bay Area in the past year or two, and you can just take a look at the range, but I just want to highlight where are we seeing cases of human trafficking in the Bay Area. Most commonly in nursing home care, elderly care, domestic servitude and child care. janitorial work, restaurant work, begging and peddling, particularly the fruit sellers on street corners, a lot of sort of brackets of door-to-door magazine sellers. These all hopefully will put warnings in your head about when you see people on the street or coming to your door selling things. And then commercial sex work, particularly CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children, very high levels in the Bay Area. As far as what's going on in the Bay Area to address it, I think I personally feel that we can talk about a movement. I can't say that we have one go-to organization or body where anyone would know to turn to for advice, statistics, etc. But why do I say that I think we can call it a movement? First of all, the awareness of human trafficking and slavery in the Bay Area has really increased and deepened. I mentioned this weekend that I've been really impressed with how many freshmen come to Stanford and take my course, and they know about human trafficking because they learned about it in high school, or they participated in some kind of anti-trafficking work through their church or some other youth organization. There was just this past year in Santa Clara County sponsored a contest among local high schools to come up with anti-trafficking posters, sort of awareness. And these were high school students, and they're tremendous. And you'll see the results of these, at least the winner, the first prize winner, who was a junior in high school. And his poster is going to be put on Bay Area buses and hopefully billboards very soon. So again, it's really starting, people are learning at a much earlier age, which is fantastic. We see very active participation in a wide range of anti-trafficking events and campaigns from high schools to youth groups, university campuses, faith-based groups. The number of trainings that are currently being done and have been done in the Bay Area is really cause for optimism. Not just police departments, which you would hope was happening, but more recently hospitality industry. This is in part because of the upcoming Super Bowl. There's been a real campaign to train hotel workers. I'm also involved in an effort to do an online training that can be taken very quickly on a mobile device by restaurant and bar workers. But also the County of Santa Clara has trained all public transport workers. The BTA rail lines, the buses, and it's really spreading. And then one of the initiatives that I'm involved with, No Trafficking Ahead, we've been really heartened because it is a collaboration that, first of all, already has about 53 different agencies across the Bay Area signed on, and it's multi-sectoral. We're talking about law enforcement, faith-based, direct service providers, a broad range of organizations and agencies. And we're coming to the table from 7 different counties in the Bay Area. Again, recognizing that it can't stay in one small locale and really provide the services and make the dent in the human trafficking problem without a broader reach and collaboration and networking, so that if you have someone show up in Monterey County or from Monterey County, who you should link them up with for the proper services, for the proper language translation facilities. And what I think is really important is that all 3 of the schools of sort of thought and action that Maurice talked about are present. They're present in the Bay Area, and they're increasingly collaborating, again, because they understand that law enforcement really understands that their approach is important, but it's not going, it will maybe, hopefully, take care of getting someone out of a situation and maybe nabbing a trafficker, but they understand that they can't provide any of the services that survivors need, and they want to know. And they often will take some of the people from the direct service providers organizations with them when they believe that they have some survivors to to extract. So the last thing I'll say is just throw out a couple of projects that we're working on in the Bay Area that again have drawn incredible cooperation and collaboration in the Bay Area. One is a local mayoral resolution that was started in San Francisco, and that individuals throughout the Bay Area are now taking to the mayors of their cities and towns to get them to sign on to pledge to contract services and particularly during the Super Bowl, for example, for hotels to use institutions and companies that are taking a stand against human trafficking, that are trying to audit their supply chain, that are training their employees to recognize human trafficking. And so we're trying to get cities, because a lot of resources are consumed and contracted out by cities, by city governments, and that's a way to not only increase awareness but increase reach. There's hotel outreach. We're doing media training in about 2 weeks for survivors of human trafficking so that they can feel empowered to talk to the media on their own terms, because the media is already starting to descend to talk, to write stories about human trafficking, and we want to help survivors tell their own story and be able to have the media write the story that they think should be out there rather than what they think the reporters already want to write about. We're also working on mapping businesses, local businesses that take a stand against human trafficking, and putting together an online community resource guide so that everyone who deals with the issue knows where to send survivors to or who to hook them up with for their needs. So the last thing I wanted to say, also to echo something that Maurice brought up, is, you know, if you're sitting there thinking, well, what could I do? There's a really great one coming up, and that again is this platform, presidential platform. It's in its beginning stages, but it's going to have to move rapidly, which is why we're going to need a lot of help. But very briefly, it's coming out of United Way. And the hope is to put together a campaign, well, not the hope, the plan is to put together a campaign to have the presidential candidates make a pledge to come up with a budget of 2 cents per dollar that traffickers earn from exploiting human beings across the globe, and to give 2 cents per dollar as a budget for fighting trafficking. And it would be allocated domestically and internationally, again, according to the presidential candidates and then the president. But that effort would change the allocation of funding from the U.S. government for anti-slavery work from $120 million to $3 billion per year. And so we need people to work in their communities to get them, first of all, to endorse the campaign, to get to the candidates the message that this is something we demand, because they aren't going to do it unless we demand. We need campus groups to organize, to get the word out, and you should, I will give you an email to contact if you are part of an organization that wants to sign on and support it, or I'm hoping that people, I'm going to look at Nicole because I know she's linked in with the undergraduates here, that we could, and paying, that we could stay in contact to do something on campus. But the person in charge of this effort is Mara Kelly at UnitedWay.org. And I'll end on that note because, you know, it's a positive note and a real path to go forward. Thank you.
So we have about 15 minutes for questions. You guys can just raise your hands and let them select you.
And maybe tell us who you are, because I don't think we don't know everyone.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. My name is Corella Sarchi. I'm with the United Nations Film Festival for Human Rights. So the 2 questions I have, there's been a lot of talk that the United Nations is weakening and been weakening over the past years. How do you think this is going to work with the new goals that are coming up? Do you think that is a positive thing, or do you think it's just kind of going to be brushed over?
I mean, my own take is I think that the inclusion, and we advocated for this along with many other organizations is the inclusion of specific goal for the eradication of slavery, and then it's actually embedded, there's anti-trafficking language embedded in some of the other SDGs as well. And we actually think this is quite useful. I base that off of the history with the Millennium Development Goals. Because the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals actually gave all the advocacy organizations a club to use with governments, because the governments have now signed on to this. They said, we now pledge to do the following. And that's what this vote in the UN did, is to have 193 nations sign on and say, we now pledge to eradicate slavery in our country. And that then creates the basis on which advocacy coalitions can say, okay, you promised you would do this, where's the national plan of action, what's the budget you've put behind it, what are you doing about law enforcement? And so we think this is actually a very constructive and positive step to have this included. It won't implement itself, but we do think this is very helpful. Katherine, what do you think?
No, that's.
So I would say, I was at a seminar a couple days ago with the attorneys who were working on this, and they said the thing that has to be done is there can't just be a commitment saying, yes, we will do this, we will do this. It has to be a result. You know, we will eliminate 20 million trafficking. You have to have a result. The other thing they said that, because the UN has been going through a rough time right now, they see the work being accomplished by small groups, small ethics groups, similar to what you are doing. And that's where the power is going to come from in making this work through. And Margaret Wheatley, I don't know if you know her, she's from Harvard, Margaret Wheatley, has started a new campaign called Warriors for the Human Spirit, which I think is going to be wonderful. But it's all built up around these small communities. But she has a training for it that you might want to look at.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alina. I'm an attorney here. So I have two questions. The first is, with the hotline, how do you advertise that number, or how have you?
You know,
It's very effective.
Certainly in the Bay Area, we're trying to get, and it's not like there's resistance, but every organization that deals with human trafficking puts that on their website, on their literature as, you know, this is who you should call. It's kind of difficult because sometimes we'll be in a meeting and there's some people who say, well, shouldn't, like for example, for the Super Bowl, shouldn't we have a local hotline? And most of us say, no, that's terrible, because the hotline will disappear February 10th, and then what do people do? And you want something, first of all, it's easy to remember, you want to get the statistics, and it's just going to be chaos if every state, every county, every city then creates a new number. So one of the things with this initiative that has 50-some organizations signed on to and working together with, one of the requirements to be a member is that you pledge to use the hotline number. There are little cards, there are many different ways. Actually, one of my students in the service learning project is working on direct outreach, and we're trying to come up with new ways to reach people who are in situations of human trafficking, and any way that people can come up with. It might be a tiny strip, like a fortune cookie strip, with the national hotline number put in packaging of tampons and sanitary napkins, or soap bars in hotels, anything that could possibly get to potential victims of human trafficking that would have that hotline. And I think the latest I've heard from sort of the Western states representative from Polaris Foundation is that they're finding that more of the actual contact from survivors to the hotline are coming from text messages. So we're trying to make sure that the text messages. So I've got a poster outside my office door. We can, anybody I think who.
What's the number?
It's, let's see, it's 877-3737. and the text is "be free." And we tell people often at lectures, put this in your cell phone. So anyone, and hopefully you've seen it some places. And put it up somewhere, put it in your residence where you live, or take it to groups that you belong to, church or something, put up a poster.
I'm Betsy Bowman with Benetech. We're sort of across the street, but we do work around the world with technology for underserved communities that include human rights organizations. So we do secure data gathering technology, whether it's things like you're talking about, questionnaires, but lists of groups sort of fighting human rights issues around the world. And I guess I just wanted specifically in this area to hear more comments on how you think different ways that technology can help be part of the solution, because it's clearly part of the problem.
So I've got something to go.
Sure.
So there's a lot of people doing really interesting work. So there's something that's been very helpful in terms of data collection, in facilitating data collection, because as I said, the gap is including technology can make that much easier. There's the potential for really interesting work around the use of satellite imagery, because we know that there are certain kinds of facilities, like depending on the country, brick-fields, stone quarries, and so on. And what would be great is to have sort of a master list of those suspect work sites that then people could go out to to detect whether slavery is occurring in those work sites and really systematically go through them. We had a speaker at the forum who gave an amazing example, because there was satellite imagery that was used to track vessels that were suspected of having slavery on the fishing vessels. And they were able to sort of basically get down, actually able to see the name of the fishing vessel and actually detect illegal activity going on the high seas. So that was another good example. There's a group called Thorn that is using, basically tracking people who are looking for child sexual exploitation online, and basically reversing the search and coming back and saying, we now see you, we know who you are. DARPA has done some really interesting work on the dark web, because much of this is taking place on the dark web, again, to use their resources and then align themselves with law enforcement agencies really around the country, with Interpol and so on. So there are lots of potential. It would be I see potential applications for awareness raising, because one of the great things is that everybody everywhere now has a cell phone. It's really, in the poorest villages, people have these, very simple cell phones, and I think there's an untapped opportunity to use those for awareness raising. So there are lots of potential applications. Polaris, that we've mentioned, did a joint venture with Palantir to do mining of the telephone data. So this is just a few examples I can think of.
Yeah, I think law enforcement in particular could really use help, because they don't have the resources or the knowledge, but and it's those using mining data, particularly I would think for financial, because that's one of the big problems. You can do so much anonymously, be it purchase pornography and get involved in some of the online sex, which is very often with children, the websites and the pay, be able to track the providers, the clients, the money, and to have it be some sort of global tracking is really important. There's a lot of work done, particularly with the sexual exploitation of children, and looking at ads online on some back page, Craigslist, that kind of thing, and trying to match up the photos with records and data of missing children. And if there's a match, and they can home in, and you can use GPS, and you can use all kinds of identifications to figure out, okay, where are they? And then you can get law enforcement. So, and I think as someone who's, I'm not a data person at all, but I think being able to do sort of that deep data analysis and crossing, there are ways that, I mean, I can't even imagine, but I'm sure that you could sit down with particularly someone who works on anti-trafficking and law enforcement. They could say, God, if we could only have somebody supply this to us. But I think increasingly the financial part would be something to really tap.
I think it'd be really interesting to take some of that deep data mining on the financial pieces or some of those other pieces and connect it to the anecdotes and the data collection in the context that you mentioned on the ground. That's really interesting.
And then I would suspect also trying to do things with labor recruiters and who they recruit and where they take them and where they get documents and who's using the labor. I don't know if anything is set up for that.
Jesse, you have a question.
Well, I don't want to take others' questions. I was just gonna maybe ask if you could share some of the ways we talked about looking at other movements and successes that they've had, or how we could integrate other movements into the fight against slavery that are related, like, you know, women's rights or children's rights or things like that. But I definitely defer to the
Sure, that was a really good question.
Okay.
Yeah, we talked a lot about this problem of being a field that is in its infancy and needs studies in particular and legitimation of practices. You know, especially donors might want to say, well, let's see, you know, how do you know that works? And the NGOs don't have the bandwidth or the money or the resources or even the tools laid out. But we know, we talked a lot about the fact that, you know, we sort of intuitively and anecdotally know these things work, and so there's this need to use the research for domestic violence or child labor and the studies that have been done to show what types of interventions work and to measure effectiveness instead of waiting 10 years and for $1 million to be able to do a study to try to and to have a little bit more cross-fertilization of strategies.
I would draw attention to 3 lessons, because I come out of the public health field. That's really my background. And actually, the global health movement's had tremendous successes in terms of reducing child mortality, maternal mortality, HIV/AIDS, you know, contraceptive prevalence. There's actually been huge progress over the last 30 years. And just a few things that really count. One is about creating a sense of urgency, because you really have to transition. There are an infinite number of unsatisfactory conditions in the world, and you have to seize on opportunities to transform a condition into an urgent problem that demands the attention of policymakers. And you have to be really opportunistic when those occasions arise. You have to be able to demonstrate solutions, which is where the sort of demonstration of the efficacy of interventions. Because it's not enough to say, oh, there's a terrible problem. What you have, because politicians don't want to fund problems, they want to fund solutions. And you know, so being able to say, look, we were able to demonstrate at some reasonable scale, you know, even if it's a pilot program, that this really made a huge difference in the lives of communities, then it changed. I remember, because I was part of some of this, it was one thing to say a lot of children are dying. That's sad. It was a different conversation 30 years ago to say, we now have a package of critical interventions that we can demonstrate through this set of pilot programs brought about radical reductions in child. So, Senator, the question isn't whether we can save children. The question is whether you will appropriate the money to save millions of children. And that's a totally different conversation, because we now know how to do it. The question is, will you get behind the effort to make this happen, since we now have the knowledge to make it, the technology to make this happen. And the third has to do with the breadth of the coalition. One of the reasons that the AIDS movement became so successful, and it took, I have to say, if people forget, it actually took like 25 years for this to happen. It didn't, you know, there was no magic moment, but you ended up with this very broad coalition of course, the gay activists, public health people, the humanitarian community. But then what got added to that was the national security community, because the CIA started coming out with reports, as did the Defense Department, saying that the pace of infection among soldiers in militaries that we care about, Kenya, South Africa, Thailand, that it was imploding, it risked imploding those militaries, and that this was now posing a national security threat to the United States. So you had the defense establishment begin to line up around the importance of doing this. Business began to see this as a threat to their labor force. So you ended up with, at the table, you'd have 4-star generals, ACT UP, and Motorola at the table. And when that began to happen, it created a safe space for real political action.
And also, let me just add that another sort of overlap that we see slowly happening is that, say, in emergency rooms in hospitals. I mean, it's now, of course, they're going to screen for domestic violence or abuse against children. And one of the things that are happening is there are people in trainings, and actually some of my students in service learning were involved in this as well, to make doctors and nurses, particularly in emergency rooms, who might come in contact with people who are in a situation of human trafficking, to give them, first of all, awareness and then some red flags so that they might be able to, one of the things that my students worked on with another agency was to have a big poster in emergency rooms, and it was both for the medical staff and the potential human trafficking survivors, because it had little tiny tear-off cards in 10 different languages that had the hotline on it. So that maybe a doctor, even if the person doesn't want to say anything, they could hand them something. And part of the project was to figure out, well, what do you say? Because one of the things we find is that no one ever identifies themselves as a victim of human trafficking. So it's part of the challenge is to come up with a way that would be, are you in this kind of situation? Do you need help? Is someone restricting your movement, or are you not getting paid for your labor? And so that kind of answers a couple questions, a way to get the hotline and a way to make it more automatic, like it has become. And again, and it also took a long time for domestic violence to become something that is that mandatory.
Yes, I used to do training and outreach for Help SCC Santa Clara County, which was a precursor to the 211 system. And the thing I found out, which did shock me, was that many victims were, some of them were citizens. But the problem that I couldn't help them beyond helping them apply for Medi-Cal or something like that, is that they had a language barrier, and I couldn't offer them an alternative. Could I guarantee them a place to live and a job and money to go back home where they owed money, and they had family back home, so it's not a matter of just them disappearing. And because I couldn't offer that, they would leave the situation they were in. And their basic plan was just to work a few decades until they got old enough where they could get SSI and maybe get subsidized housing. And that was their American dream, because that was still better here, being exploited, working 6.5 days from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. was still better than the alternative. And I couldn't offer an alternative to that. I would tell them this is illegal and this isn't right, and they say, but you can't offer me something better, which was right.
Well, see, that's kind of the point of the need for networks and collaboration, and all the schools of thought and action working together, because you personally can't, but it's here. It's here in the Bay Area. I can't say that everyone gets it or that it's a fast process, but there are service providers who can provide shelter, medical care, translation services, legal services. They can work, there's not enough by any means of, say, lawyers to work on helping to get T visas, but those resources are out there. And calling the national hotline is a first step, because they know who to call in the Bay Area. And so you could call for them, or that person could call, and they can transfer them to the services in the Bay Area, and with language-specific help.
Yeah, and so basically, I was able to get them Medi-Cal, but there was no, you know, there was no program to actually help them find, you know, jobs or teach them English or, you know, or find housing.
It's worth, you know, I can give you a phone number or a website to contact, and you can talk to, I mean, maybe you can't reach that same person again, I don't know, you have their
No,
information. so
there was
you
actually
know.
quite a few I've met.
Okay.
And that was the problem, is
Yeah, it's.
they said I didn't understand because I couldn't offer them something better, just telling them it was wrong.
It's really dispersed,
Mhm.
but that's why the networks, and certainly in the Bay Area, the networks of individuals who do this work and refer each other, who know each other and trust each other and can really make things happen. It's really heartening.
Okay.
I mean, we need more, without a doubt, more resources, more people, but.
Okay, thank you.
I think we better end there. So thank you all again for coming, and thank you once again to our speakers so much.